like many of you, Tracy and I find that some of our most valuable learning happens when we're talking to other learning designers and, conversations we have at conferences, which we're not really doing quite so much this year, but, might be conversations in the hallway or email exchanges or just conversations. And I'm totally stepping on Tracy's lines here, but the idea behind the Nerdy Shop Talk series is we wanted to kind of have some of those conversations out loud and let people eavesdrop in and then ask questions or add to the conversation wherever possible. So that's what we're doing today. So Tracy, do you want to?
Yeah, so I will start. I will introduce Julie. Julie is an instructional designer and author of Design for How People Learn, which is one of the best-selling instructional design books available. And I was going to hold mine up, but it's not here. It's at home on my desk at my work office. Anyways, she is a respected speaker and instructional designer and has been recognized as a guild master by the e-learning guild.
Yeah, and Tracy Parrish, my co-host, is one of those people who just gets things done. She's an educational technology specialist. She's does instructional design, project management, development, kind of all of the pieces. And she's also a frequent speaker at industry events. She's an Articulate community hero. She's a moderator of Learn Chat, which if you're on Twitter, you should totally check out on Thursday nights. And she curates a great list of like free e-learning resources. And so we've been doing this for kind of on and off for about a year, the Nerdy Shop Talk. And so it's really just kind of interesting questions that we want to talk about. So it's often stuff that we maybe don't always know the answers to. This particular topic, which is designing for complicated complexity, it comes from the fact that I think as an industry, we have pretty good tool sets for things where there's really well-defined performance. So we know exactly how we want people to take blood pressure. We know exactly how we want people to process a loan application, or anything where there's a procedure that's set out and there's SOPs and all of that kind of stuff. But once we get into some of these other areas where things are a little bit more ambiguous, it starts to get harder. And I'm not sure that our toolbox is everything that it should be when we get into some of these more ambiguous areas. And so the people we brought to talk about that today, Mirjam Neelen is the head of global learning design and learning sciences at Novartis. But she's also the author of this 3-star learning experiences blog, which is great. Has a lot of nice, really stuff on Mirjam, what do you call it? Evidence-backed,
evidence-informed.
And evidence-informed, thank you. Which that's a whole nother conversation we'll have sometime. And also the book, which, well, there it is, Evidence-Informed Learning Design is the title of the book. And she and I have had a few conversations about this already, so we're kind of doing the continuation version. And then Emma Weber is the founder of Lever Transfer of Learning, and her company really focuses on, okay, you've been to training, now what? How do we actually continue to support support performance and actually, sort of help people develop some results out of this. She's got some great books that I don't have the titles of handy, but we'll give you the links for that. And also has done some super interesting stuff on chatbots and reinforcement that I think is also a topic for, well, maybe it'll be a topic today, but it's also some really interesting stuff there. So did I forget anything really crucial in the bios, people? Is there anything else you want to mention right now? We'll give you a chance at the end as well.
All right.
I think you did an excellent job.
Okay, fantastic. So let's start out with this question, the sort of this term complex skill. And again, I think this is maybe a follow-on of some conversations that Mirjam and I have already had about this. But Mirjam, how do you think about complex skills?
For me, it's about a skill with a lot of elements that interact with each other. So, for example, if you think about a language and when you have to translate words, that's not a complex skill because it's one element, which is the word element. And in contrast, when you have to like translate sentences, that is a complex skill because you need to, think about how to, I don't know how to pronounce this, but like conjugate, like verbs and gender and, So there's many elements that you need to consider. So that's an example of a more complex skill. So it's when there's actually different skills that are interacting with each other when you're completing a task.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and we've had some conversations about it because there's the number of elements that are going into it, but then there's also, I think, something about the ambiguity of correct performance. So again, like in systems, particularly safety or systems where there's, a lot of money involved, we tend to kind of figure out exactly what we think right performance is. But in some other areas, it's a lot more ambiguous. So for example, safety procedures for airplanes, right? Like they've got very clear lists about what correct performance looks like, how they're going to do it. And it could have many, many steps, and it could be really quite complicated, but complex to a certain extent is also things where maybe we're not sure what the right answer is. So for example, how do you manage a person? Like, as a manager, how do you provide feedback? Well, it's going to depend on a lot of variables, and it's going to be different with this employee versus this employee, and it's going to depend on the relationship, and it's going to depend on the circumstances, and it's going to depend on, the system that they're operating in. And so I think that those are often kind of complex as well. And part of my definition for complex comes out of, it's the Cynefin framework, which I'm curious if people are familiar with that one or not. I'll put it in the chat because it's a weird word. It's Welsh, and it's by Dave Snowden, and he talks about it with organizational design. He talks about how there's, I think the word they're using now is clear. Actually, it used to be simple or obvious, but I think they're actually using clear in the most recent version of it. And that's that defined performance. Like there's a procedure. Then there's complicated, which is people learn it over time through repeated examples. So I used to teach, way back when, I used to teach prep classes for people who were taking the GMATs for business school. And like you could cover the math pretty easily because math had clear rules and there were right answers and things like that. But when we got to the verbal section, that was much harder to like give people strategies for, because the way that you get good at verbal stuff is you read a lot, or you do a lot with it over time. And so that's much more of like a pattern recognition kind of thing than it is a hard and fast set of rules. And then within Cynefin, they talk about complex as being something where conditions are changing. And so you need a method of inquiry. You need a way to kind of explore, get it through data, come back, analyze it, and then, and then potentially repeat that process. And then chaotic is everything's a mess and you're going to have to act before you have all the information, like, oh, I don't know, a pandemic maybe. And you're going to have to do triage as much as you can to try to restore order into the system and things like that. And so he has a very specific definition for complex that I think is a little bit different. But those are some of the things that I think we're working with and kind of trying to reconcile.
And Julie, when I saw that we were going to be talking about complex skills, I immediately thought I've been invited to the wrong chat because I have no idea what Julie means by that. Let's try and look this up. The way I sort of tend to think about it, and it's kind of a less complicated way, is that often those skills are actually stretching for people, and there is no one way, and it really kind of does start to come down to the sort of the individual interpretation and personal way that you may do it. And it's like you're talking about, there's so many different variables, not just within the skill, but within the system itself. So
I think that's a really good point, Emma, because I was just thinking when Julie was talking that when, my initial example about a complex skill, that's the skill like in itself. But I actually think what we're talking about now are more what I would call a complex task. And within that complex task, you have all these interacting skills and knowledge and attitudes elements, which is, and what you were saying, Emma, that there is no like one right way. And when you end up like in a novel situation, you still have to be able to perform. And that's when you need to kind of like start, solving problems and critical thinking and creativity and all that kind of, well, creative thinking. I don't know if it's creativity, but anyway, but where you need to like interpret and still do the best you can.
Yeah. Well, that's such an interesting, like those kind of meta skills. So like one of the ones that always comes up when I'm talking to clients is they're like, can we teach problem solving? And I'm like, maybe, like what does that actually look like? What is teaching somebody problem solving? You can teach methods of inquiry. You can teach like, here's how to frame the problem and think about it. But there's another skill in there, right? That some people are good at ferreting away at the problem until they start to, things, or they're good at asking the right questions, or they're good at, and like how do you get into some of those kinds of things?
That reminds me of the interview I did with Jeroen van Marienboer a while ago, where he actually talked about that, and he called that like a meta myth in our field, that what we do there is confusing the goal with the method. So when people need to get better at problem solving, we teach them that through problem solving, which is silly because you don't learn problem solving through general problem solving. You learn problem solving in a context of a certain task.
Yeah.
So we do that constantly, like in learning and development, where we use, where we confuse the two. Like, oh, people need to learn how to do metacognition. Oh, we throw a problem at them, and they need to kind of like show that they can regulate their own learning. No.
Yeah. Well, is it just that you can't divorce those things from context? Like they have to be embedded in context? There's no.
But
Right,
you,
but if you don't, sorry, go ahead, Emma.
No. I'm just wondering though, if you can't, as you're going through that and having the real context that you're actually learning your problem solving in, you can't then actually take a view of what you're doing that then makes that whole experience useful to you next time round as well. To me, that would be the learning.
Yeah. So,
like you're actually doing it. So as Casey too has just said, yeah, that you're learning by doing it, but then actually you're observing how you're doing it to actually then do the learning.
Right. So is it maybe like, okay, I did the thing, now I need to go back and look and figure out how did I do the thing so that I can figure out how to do it someplace else, maybe?
But now we're assuming that when people need to learn this complex task, that we do that by letting them do it. That's not the way to do it, right? First, you need to show them how to do it.
Yeah.
So that's where the worked examples come in. So you show them how to do it. You show them what questions to ask at certain points in the task. You show them what kind of things to consider. So you give them like a completely worked out example, and then you kind of like slowly over time take the scaffolding away, so that, as Emma is suggesting, you start to see how you're solving the problem and what kind of considerations you're making when you're solving the problem.
Yeah, no, I think that completely makes sense. And the issue of how many examples do you need to see in order to start to kind of understand it, that's when I think that there's so much opportunity in what we're doing in terms of making sure people get exposed to way more examples than I think we're currently doing. Like some of the Anders Ericsson stuff on that, right? Like how many examples do you need to see to get good at reading an X-ray, and how can we accelerate that so that you see way more examples of the thing? That's also what AI is good at. But but that question, like, right? If you can see, I think managers giving feedback, it can often be complex. Like sometimes it's straightforward, but a lot of times it's, it has all these variables to it. But if I see lots of examples so that I can start to understand better about what's working and what's not working? But you need to get the feedback too about which of those are actually successful, right? So why is this why is this such a hard problem? In terms of, I think really not even so much complex stuff, but the like getting better at kind of creating learning experiences for it. What are some of the things that you sort of think are really necessary or critical elements if we're creating learning experiences for people?
I think it's two things. Like there's no initial investment, sufficient investment in understanding what a task actually looks like and
Mm,
what it takes to complete that task, and what are the critical decision making points within that task, where are the likely misconceptions, where are people, where are the pitfalls, all that type of stuff. And the second part is, and that's feeds into the first part, is that people in L&D usually don't have the skills to do that type of analysis.
right. Right. So Emma, when you get a new kind of task that you're doing transfer stuff for, what's like the process that you go through when you are helping figure out what should the transfer activities look like and things like that?
So Julie, the really interesting thing is that because I specialize so much in transfer and the behavioral change piece, we actually rely on the learning being robust to actually get people to that stage, and that the previous part of doing the analysis of what learning is actually required and how we're going to get people to the point where they can actually apply, I'm often not involved in that conversation. And so I think I did a blog post at one point called My Spoiled Past. My spoiled past being, I was so lucky at the beginning of starting my business to be working with some exceptional learning designers, and that had already done really, really good work in that space. And what I saw was the gap was in learning transfer. So that's where I focused. But interestingly, as the journey has continued, Miriam, to your point, I think, and I think learning designers recognize this, because we've had conversations about this before, that upfront piece just is not really done robustly enough. And one of the books that I direct people to, even this week I was directing someone to it, is Patty's book, which Beyond Learning Objectives. I don't know if anyone knows Jack and Patty's work. And Miriam, I'd be interested, it's probably, and whether there's more thorough things that we can be doing, but even just that framework of really breaking down what's the learning objectives, kind of what's the knowledge objectives of what do people really need to know, but what's the behavioral objectives and how are people going to apply it. So just even sort of just really breaking it down, that simply helps me. And if someone can't tell me what a behavioral objective is, if someone's not going to be able to write an action plan or have a behavior coming out of a learning, then I'm kind of, that's not the learning for me to support. But you need to know what behaviors you're getting to be able to know that that's right.
I actually love that title, right? Beyond the learning objectives, because actually when we think about complex tasks, the learning objectives are not important whatsoever.
Yes.
Like it's just about the task. What do people need to complete the task? And as long as you focus on that, you don't need any learning objectives, because all learning objectives do is kind of like fragment, that whole of the task. I also wonder, Julie, you were just talking about the difference between complicated and complex, right? And I think there are problems nowadays in organizations where nobody's really sure what good looks like, right? So that would be kind of like a pure complex problem, the way you defined it using Cynefin. But I think there's also a lot of problems that are actually complicated, but we kind of have to treat them as complex because no one has done like a proper problem analysis. Because in my experience, even the business doesn't always do a good job, like really understanding what the problem is.
Right.
There's some senior leader who identifies a certain problem or challenge, and then everybody jumps on it and runs with it without really having any data around what the actual problem is. And then you go towards the complex side of the spectrum, and you actually need to do your task analysis as you go, like ongoing, and have feedback loops to figure out, are you moving in the right direction? But I think it's partly because of a lack of analysis initially. would be my hypotheses, which I would need to test.
Yeah, no. It's an interesting thing because like some of it comes down to what's the cheapest way to manage it, right? So I can get somebody to a level of expertise in a complicated task by just exposing them to a lot of case examples, and eventually, assuming they're paying attention and they're kind of observing what's working and what's not working, they're going to get there, right? But then we could also just figure out what the rule set is, right? Like do the mapping and the flow chart and kind of figure this all out. And I think the only places where we're seeing that are places where you can probably kill people if you don't get it right, because we're trying to essentially squeeze error out of the system, right? So the classic example of that is airplanes, right? You know, we want a system where we have reduced the level of error as much as possible, because a whole bunch of people die if we don't. And so they've like done an enormous amount of heavy lifting to take something, because we've only had flight for what, like a bit over 100 years, right? And so, you know, the first, I don't know, third of the, you know, the existence of flight, people learned it by like going up with a pilot who knew what they were doing, and they figured it out, and they kind of learned from experience. And now we didn't, the level of error was unacceptable at that point. And so what we did is we sort of said, we're going to proceduralize the heck out of this, because that's how we reduce error in the system. And there's some really nice stuff in Nassim Taleb's Anti-Fragility. The people familiar with that one, where he talks about you have fragile systems, and so one big punch kind of takes it out. So, you know, like the levee system in New Orleans before Hurricane Katrina was fragile, right? Like they thought it was okay, but you know, one big punch and the whole thing kind of falls down. Or the real estate market in 2008 was fragile, and you know, it all kind of blew up because it had gotten sort of extenuated out. But then he talks about there's robust systems where they can take a lot of punches, but there's it can take a lot of punches, but it's just very strong, and eventually you could overwhelm it, but it can take a lot of abuse, right? And then he talks about anti-fragile systems, which are like your immune system, where abuse, you know, you can still overwhelm it, but smaller abuse is necessary to make the system stronger. And it has to do with what's the level of risk in the system and things like that. But he talks about how you know, the airline safety is a case of an anti-fragile system. So if there's an accident in the airline system, a whole bunch of investigators descend on that, figure out what happened, figure out what changes you need to have for to prevent that error from happening again. And then the time frame for it disseminating through the whole air traffic system is something crazy, like 30 days. Like it will get updates out to, you know, basically the whole world about this airplane procedure within like an incredibly short period of time. I might be exaggerating, but it was still a shockingly short amount of time. And so that's a case of an anti-fragile system where every abuse that happens strengthens the overall system, because there's a really robust way to learn from that error and to fix it. And I think that there's something there where these are connecting up, like effective, complex learning has an element where there's a, you know, there's some kind of cycle of, okay, we tried the thing, what did we learn from it? We learned this, okay, we'll do it better next time, or something like that. But I'm getting a little bit attenuated there, so I'm not sure if I'm still.
Yeah, because I am also really curious to hear from you, Emma, because people, I mean, they hire you because they think transfer is really, really critical, which is a bit like ironic in the first place. I think that, you know, that people are kind of like, that's not always the case, because you would hope that when you design something that people would care about that in the first place. But so what kind of, you know, problems are you dealing with?
So it's often designed as part of a solution. So it's not that it's happened or they did some learning and the transfer didn't happen. It's actually holistically at the beginning saying, hey, we need this kind of process within our overall design to help us get an outcome. And Julie, it's just as you were telling that story, a couple of things came into my mind. I mean, isn't that the whole thing that we have to do? And for me, that is the principle of transfer, is you are practicing applying what it is that you have learned. And during that practice, you actually, I say practice, you're actually doing it. So it's not that you take it out of your real world and say, oh, I'm going to have a practice environment No, just do it, even if you start to do it in a small way. And then you reflect on what happened. Did it go well? Did it not go well? What did I, what worked, what didn't? What do I need to do next time to get it even better? So that is to me, that is the process as part of an application phase. But right back to the beginning there, Julie, where you were talking about the whole thing of where someone's life depends on it, we've got really good at it. I think part of the challenge is that often, if we're talking about, say, giving feedback was an example, we said that people can get away with doing it badly.
Mm-hmm.
And because people can get away with doing it badly or doing it suboptimal or even kind of doing it okay, and then other people do it brilliantly,
Mm-hmm.
well, when we're doing some kind of learning to try and solve whatever problem that is solving, we want everyone to do it brilliantly.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the challenge is when they get back to the workplace, they kind of can get away with not doing it brilliantly. So that's, I think, back to your point of, if everyone's lives depended on it, and then it becomes to the, well, why? What is your own personal why? Not just what's the organizational why, what's your personal why for why you are going to actually change your behavior.
Yeah. No, I think that one's so interesting because I think there's a denial about the fact that it is more or less important in certain circumstances. The example that I always use for this one is if you're training flight attendants, you've got your module on certain safety procedures and your module on drink service. And if I put that in front of people, they clearly can identify that the safety procedures need to be more error-free than drink service, right? Like if they screw up something about drink service, nobody dies for the most part, unless there's a peanut allergy or something. But like there's, basically you can have more error in the thing. But if you ask people up front, like that question, and I have asked it, they're like, everything's important. Everything needs to be 100%. And I'm like, so I think there's something about the reality of that, like the issue of being able to genuinely recognize like how much error is allowable in the system and what's okay to what's okay to practice and maybe get wrong, and we've got mechanisms to correct for it, versus what has to be 100% right out of the gate, or as close to 100% as we can get it. So when you get requests, Emma, are there things that make you go, oh, okay, like things that are feeling really much harder than others in terms of types of things that you're asked to do transfer for?
I think it goes back to that whole clarity thing. I start to panic if people can't. I was on a call the other day, and as we were going through the call, we were really trying to nut out from each module were the behavior actions.
Mm-hmm.
And the instructional designer said, oh no, they won't be able to start applying it until they've done module 6. And I was like, okay, let's hang fire here a second then, because we may be in trouble if we're trying to get. So then it's like, and this is interesting because then she's saying, well, after module 1, I just want them to observe. Well, observing what you're doing is a behavior of actually. So you could break it down to say, okay, well, module 1, I'm in observation mode, and blah blah blah. These are the different things that I'm actually going to observe about that. But before, they were really thinking there were definitely behavioral things that they wanted to come out of each module. But when we really got down to it, it was, and in fact, they said, oh, we don't want them to start applying it from module 1 because we won't have shown them everything yet, and they'll get it, and it'll go really badly.
But it's weird, right? Because it almost sounds like, well, to me, it's completely crazy that transfer is almost like an afterthought. Like transfer should be completely integrated in the design itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so going from observation to application, of course you need examples and stuff, but you need to start practicing as soon as possible, right? With the right level of support. And then you slowly take away the level of support, and then you should like almost naturally move to like transfer in the real context. Of course, you need, other types of support like on the job, like maybe the manager needs some kind of templates to be able to give you feedback, with a rubric or something, I don't know, so that they know what to watch for, and et cetera, et cetera. There are other ways, but
Mirjam, I think that's half the problem where you said there. So you do you have your practice, you have your support, which you might be practicing in a learning environment first, and then you kind of, and then I think you just said, and then hopefully it transfers back into the job. It's, in this, we can't have a hopeful about it, right? We have to have the whole strategy of how it gets back into the day to day. And so I think there's a distinction between practicing to get to the point where you can actually then do it in the real world, or whether it is the sort of skill, and Julie, this would come to your point where you're sort of saying, some skills, it doesn't matter if you get it wrong. So there will be some things that you could actually go straight to practice in the real world, like low risk. Mm-hmm. But it's actually, isn't, let's not get too metaphysical, but isn't life just one big practice?
Yeah.
I don't know about anyone else at the moment, but
no. Well, so this is a question I've been chewing on for a couple of years, and I'll ask it. I'll throw it out here again, and I'm not really expecting an answer to it, because the question of how to determine how much practice is needed, and of course the answer is until they can do it, right? Like that's the answer. But like I've been trying to figure out, are there any heuristics, are there any guidelines that we can kind of think about, and maybe it's just a case again of having a lot of nice examples, and that's what I need to focus on, is collecting 10 or 15 or 20 different examples of like setting up practice mechanisms. Because I've been looking at things like, how do they do practice for sports, or how do they do music, or how do they do language learning, or things like that, which I think are much more kind of fully realized areas, partially because the behaviors are so visible in something like sports or music. You can tell if they can play the thing, or if they can get the baskets in, or whatever it is. But I'm trying to figure out, how do I help people? Because the answer is, I think almost always in almost every training program I've ever seen, is how much practice is needed is always more than they've planned for, right? Like there's and so I think that's maybe something that you deal with when you're dealing with the transfer question, is like, how long are people going to need this support around transfer? Or how many, like, do you feel like some heuristics are coming, or like are starting to surface in what you do around that?
I remember you and I were chatting a few months ago, Julie, and I didn't know what heuristics was, so I had to go.
Oh, sorry.
But that's all good. I did look it up, and I'm close.
I totally remember the first time I bumped into that word, and I not knowing what it was. It was a handout that said graphic design heuristics, and I got it in a graduate class, and I was like, I don't know what a heuristic is, so I should remember that. I'm sorry, but anyway.
I'm losing my thread now there, because I'm remembering how funny I thought that was. I think that the thing is, so let's come on to that. But when you were just going through the beginning there, you said people have to practice to the point they can do it. Mm-hmm. I think we've actually got to get people past the point they can do it, the point they actually do it.
Right.
Because just because you can show I've practiced enough, and now in this scenario I can now do such and such a skill, mm-hmm. that doesn't mean in the heat of the moment they are actually going to then do it. Mm-hmm. So, but I
think I'm hearing a couple of different things here, because I think it depends, right? I think it depends on the risk. Mm-hmm. I think it depends on to what extent you need to automate certain things. There are parts of tasks that you need to be able to do like this, like no thinking allowed, no waiting allowed. You need to be able to do it. So those are the things you need to practice until you over learning and stuff, until you have automated it. But there's other things that you just have a bit more leeway, you can kind of fail. That's not great, but it's okay. And then there's the parts that you don't actually need to be able to really know. You can look them up, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that this is just from the top of my head, but I think there's probably way more elements. And again, it goes back to analysis. We're not good at this, really, tearing it apart and say, okay, this is this type of problem. This part they really need to do, they really need to know this. Okay, space practice, bang. They need to, repeat. This, it's fine. They can just have a job aid or a checklist or whatever.
Mhm.
But you need to do that analysis, because otherwise you're just like, it's a shot in the dark and you're just hoping for the best.
And is there some sort of, sorry, I'm finally chiming in here.
Yeah, yeah.
Is there some sort of knowledge or some sort of assumption here that once they have practiced it enough and that they can do it, that they never forget how to do it? So
I
there's
think
an
there should
element
be
of,
the opposite assumption.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Because then there's there's a whole element of repracticing if you never get to actually do those skills.
So that also depends, right? Is it something
Mhm.
that people do every day, so they will do it, so they won't forget? Is it something that is very high risk, but it only happens once every 3 years? Well, then you need to retrain to make sure that they are still ready, at the point they need it. So again, like there's different types of contexts and situations that you
Yeah.
need to design
And
for.
I kind of tend to think it's beyond the whole sort of forgetting issue, that it is down to the issue of risk, because it is more of it, it can be a skill that you could remember. You could remember the framework, you could remember how to do it, but in that moment you would feel so vulnerable of actually using that framework or putting that whole thing forward, that you don't do it anyway. And that's not a remembering issue, because gosh, you can remember, you might even remember so badly the cold sweat that you came out into in the practice session, that you're actually, and yes, you can remember it clear as day of what the actual process looks like. I know that's probably a bit of a bad example, because we're saying we've got people here to the point where they can do it, but even if you can do it, it's still, it's beyond remembering.
Yeah, I think there's something there, because I worked on a curriculum. Oh gosh, it's almost 20 years ago now. It was a curriculum called Project Alert, and it was a drug and alcohol prevention curriculum for middle school kids, so like 11, 12, 13-year-old kids. And they used a lot of different strategies in the curriculum. The part that I was working on was helping teachers learn how to teach the curriculum. So I wasn't involved in any of the stuff that was geared at the kids, but I learned a lot about the curriculum, obviously. And they used a lot of things like social proof, or, different strategies for it. But their fundamental thing was, they're like, it's not about the information about drugs being bad, right? Like that's not helpful, and in fact, like a lot of the drug prevention curriculums were like, here's all the terrible things about crack, here's all the terrible things about cocaine, here's all the terrible things about this. And they're like, it was like consumer reports for drug use, basically, and they were like, that's not helpful. And what they really found is that the crucial thing, and they did a lot of research on this, so it was a solid thing. The crucial thing was being able to manage that awkward social moment where somebody says, do you want? And were they prepared to handle that, right? And so what they wound up doing is, it was a 13-week curriculum, and every single week they would practice in some way or another. And they did skits, or they just did brainstorming, or they did, like little films, or whatever it was. But that every single week the kids would practice their answers to that moment where somebody would say, do you want to smoke a joint, or whatever it was, so that when they actually got into that circumstance, they could go, oh no man, I'm on the track team, I'm good, or something like that. Whatever their answer was to that, they had it, basically that easy facility with that, in that super awkward situation. And so I think there's something about that we're frequently not addressing, which is, a lot of these get used in fraught circumstances where there's pressure, even if it's just time pressure or performance pressure, or, and we get into things like management, it's, nobody likes to give bad feedback, it's awkward, so getting to the point where you have this facility and you can get past some of that reluctance too.
And so one of the models that we often look at is this whole idea of building the muscle. And I think Brian raised it as muscle memory, but I sort of think of it as a behavioral muscle. In the thing I love about that example, Julie, is, if you think of the high stakes of that scenario, when someone does have to in the moment say, no, I'm not gonna do drugs. Hard hitting example here, love it. Is that, in a way, if we think, I always think of that as the 100-kilogram example, bad example for drugs here, but
right.
Like the whole thing of that is that's high pressure, high stakes, and that is worth 100, 100 of something, 100 kilos. If you're not building the muscle to be able to lift 100 kilos, the minute it comes down to lifting 100 kilos, that is going to be difficult. So for some tasks, you need to really break down and say, okay, well, what's the 5 kilo version of that? Or what's a 50 kilo version of that? And it might actually be people, you know, when they sit down and they have that really tough feedback conversation, but actually, if they've got much better going throughout of just even every week offering people some positive feedback, or, you know, a small observation, that when they actually then sit down and have a difficult conversation or whatever, they have started to build that muscle, that it's not going from 0 to, oh my God, I've got to do this thing, and it's become kind of bigger than Ben-Hur. So for me, that's part of how we apply, is to get people to really identify, well, what are the smaller steps in between that I can start to build my muscle with around that particular thing. Andrew, I see you nodding there. You can put some encouragement in the chat, Andrew. So that's one of the ways I break it down. But I love that example you've given, because what you're actually doing is you're helping them constructively build that. And I would also be thinking, is there a way to get people thinking about their own life? You know, it could even, I don't know. I mean, who wants to research this? Because would it have any relevance if people start saying no to other things that then actually helps them be able to say no to that? Or is it not relevant?
Well, you know, like something like learning to set boundaries, you know, like, you know, that's a big part of what, you know, therapists will teach you in therapy. And it is a coaching kind of thing where they talk you through examples and they help you kind of build that skill. And so I think maybe it's figuring, it might be something about being able to like ask certain questions to identify when it is something where you're going to have to build this sort of virtual muscle around it. Oh, it's interesting.
So, Julie, there was one of the thing that you mentioned, you know, you said you're sort of often looking at sports, music, and education and that kind of thing, but because they do that quite well.
Sports, music, and language learning is another one where I feel like there's a sophisticated practice around how do you bring people along. There's a sophisticated practice about practice, I think. So
yeah. So one of the fields that I really look at, oh, sorry, Mirjam, you're about to jump in, but is just mental health. And what's being done in mental health in terms of behavioral change. I think we can learn a lot in learning around that.
No, that's actually really interesting too. So things like cognitive behavioral therapy, or, you know, something like that, you know, looking at how they kind of structure that. So Mirjam, did you have something?
Well, I was just thinking that sports, music, etc. are easier in the sense that they have more like a gold standard. And for a lot of what we do, and I mean, I think it's different. I mean, when I say we, I mean those who work with knowledge workers, right? Because of course there's also people who work in customer service or the military, or where there's also more like gold standard type of stuff. Like, this is what good looks like, and this is what we're training for. But I think because one of the other fields that I look at, or two actually, is like product design and service design. And the reason is because I feel that those fields look way more holistically at problems. I think, you know, when you hear us talk, like, we're saying so many different things. Like, there are like, and I said it in my previous reply as well, but we really need to start thinking about, you know, when you talk about giving feedback to people, or, you know, being a manager, that goes way beyond skills, right? There's so many other performance enablers, as Guy Wallace would call them. You know, like, what's the culture? What are your incentives? Like, are you safe enough to give like constructive feedback to even, you know, your own manager or whatever? So there's so many different elements that we need to think of. And I think actually one of the problems that we have in L&D is that people come to us for learning stuff, which is actually not about just learning stuff. So we need different types of expertise to solve that problem. And just now that I'm, you know, just one thing I want to get on my chest as well is that I think we're just doing too much stuff about things that don't really need any learning solution. Like, we over engineer like all kinds of things. I'm like, give me a checklist, like, just let it go. Like, it's not that important, and just focus on the stuff that's really important and design well for that, and make sure your people have the capability to design well for those type of problems. And I think
Mhm.
we need like a big reshuffle to get there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think there's definitely something there. I mean, I used to do that a lot where I was like, all right, you've handed me a list of 37 learning objectives. Tell me which 3 or 4, if they don't do these, if 3 or 4 behaviors, if they don't do these at the end of this training, this was not useful, that kind of thing. But yeah, the gold standard question is an interesting one too, because like I said, I'm interested in sports and music because I think they are very mature in the sense of they've already figured a lot of this stuff out. But I think part of the reason that they were able to develop that level of maturity is because of how visible the outputs are, right? So like baseball or basketball or football or whatever, soccer, any of those kinds of things, like they collect an enormous amount of statistics. They know, like who's doing well, who's not doing well, and they've got all of these ways to kind of say yes, that was good, or no, it wasn't good enough, or all these kinds of things, versus managerial stuff, like being able to define good performance. And
Yeah, but I
in
think that's part of it, but it's also because they have their priorities straight. Like
mhm,
they know
Mhm.
what they need to invest in. They
mhm,
know what they need to achieve.
mhm.
And we are all over the place.
Yeah, that's true.
And and I
I
think
heard
that
some.
goes, sorry,
No, go
Tracy, I
ahead.
was just going to bring up Andrew's point that he raised in the chat box. His question is, if there are social dynamics involved in supporting complex tasks, is this part of our realm of learning experience designing professionals to infuse into the experience? And I think one of the interesting things is if you're thinking about sport, it's contained, we can see it. Mirjam, to your point, you know what you're trying to do. In the complex environment of the organization, there's so many different variables. But I do think as learning professionals, we need to be looking more holistically. We
Mhm,
can't just be thinking so narrow that's going to be the kind of the solution. And so our preference, and this is where we've kind of got ourselves into all sorts of challenges and opportunities, is that for me, transfer is a kind of an individual piece. It's about helping that individual have the conversation with themselves,
mhm,
because it's so individual. There's thoughts, feelings, values, beliefs, fears, and needs control our behavior, and we've got
mhm,
all these types of things going on underneath it. And that's where, for me, the what we're learning from mental health and their use of chatbots and automation to actually shift behaviors in that can really help us in learning. So
mhm.
that's a bit of a personal crusade, obviously, at the
Yeah.
moment, but I think it kind of links in a bit to the conversation. Or
Well,
maybe I'm just trying to throw in my own topic.
I no, I think it does, because I mean, but one of the things about the chatbot piece that I thought was really interesting is I've seen a few different people talk about it, but you're the only person I've seen talk about it who sort of said we basically deconstructed the conversations that we were having with people anyway, and we found a lot of commonalities. I think help me if I'm misrepresenting what you talked about with that, and then built that into a chatbot, as opposed to, I think, the way a lot of chatbot development is happening. I'm going to picture how this conversation
Right.
should go, right? So maybe, do you want to just talk to that a little bit? Because I think that's part of it, right? Like being able to kind of really break out what's already working, how do we analyze it, and how do we build something for that? Sorry, Emma, I'm probably representing this badly. If
No,
you want to just tell
no, that, I mean, that is true. It's identifying the patterns within the conversation that then link to the behavioral change, and getting the accountability and reflection, rather than necessarily trying to say, okay, I've got this conversation and I think it's going to go from this to this to this. It's actually saying, well, actually, I don't think we would have been able to, we wouldn't have, I wouldn't have been known that this was how to do it without actually kind of doing it. But the team had 20,000, one-on-one conversations. So we had been doing the conversation piece for years. And then it was actually about to say, okay, well, how do we, and because we had to replicate it around the world in different languages with humans, that then enabled us to take that and put it into the AI
Mhm.
chatbot piece or chatbot piece.
hmm And I think that's part of it, right? Like, I think the example of what you're describing is exactly what has to happen in a lot of these instances, is working from the actual data of how this works well, abstracting out the things that are effective in that, and then figuring out how to train for those or something like that. And that goes back to kind of the earliest part of the conversation, which is this sort of absence of analysis, or really kind of understanding what good looks like, and things like that. So
You've tied a couple thoughts together there for me, because you're talking about the sports, and I had just heard something on the radio news yesterday was about, I think it was Amazon working with the hockey leagues, and they are using AI to data point every instance and moment within the game, where the puck is, who was there, how did they hit it, how fast did they hit it. And then Emma tying in that your chatbot is using AI to find those conversations and find those best practices, the moments that are making the difference. And it's exciting to hear that we're building on those things, and we're starting to pull. I don't, my mind is just blown with, where do you even start pulling in AI to find those best moments?
yeah. Well, and Catherine's question, how do you even begin to do that when the skill is so complex? I think maybe the first part is not pretending that it's easy. you know so yeah.
And I wonder if that goes, Miriam, back to what you're saying. It's actually the analysis part at the beginning. Actually, is it this complex? Could there be something, where does the job aid come in? All those kind of things of really, really nutting that out. And it's kind of a bit ironic because I don't get involved in that. So I just
But
pass that to someone
I think,
exciting like you.
particularly like things like management, right? There's like a lot of it doesn't have anything to do with skills, right? It's and not even attitude. Like, a lot of managers want to be good managers and have the right attitude. They just don't have the time. Like, they're under pressure. There's like a culture where, like, they tell you, to reflect and take time, but in reality you have to deliver. So I think there's a lot that doesn't have anything to do with learning, and you can throw the training is only going to add to their stress. So I think we need to be really careful with that. So yes, Emma, it goes back to the analysis phase.
Yeah, and it depends if it's whether, is training going to add to the stress, or does the training actually support them? If we're designing training that doesn't support people and is not helping them get better at what they do and what they want to do, then for heaven's sake, we shouldn't be doing it. And
yeah, well,
and that
yeah,
might
and I
be
do.
different for different individuals. Sorry, Julie.
Oh, no, go ahead. The thing I was just thinking about is, this issue, sort of what Tracy was just saying, and Miriam, what you're saying about some of these things aren't that complex. I was just thinking about Apgar scores, which, Atul Gawande talks about in his books, like the Checklist Manifesto and stuff like that, which is this thing that used to be this sort of super complex expertise that a doctor, or maybe a midwife, would develop around recognizing if a child's in distress, and they were able to kind of simplify that into, I don't know, 5 or 6 things, whatever it is, in the Apgar score, that will predict like 80 to 90% of the issues, with a newborn. I'm making that number up, but it's something like that, where it's like, and there's still a portion, whether it's 10% or some number like that, where it doesn't, it's probably still not enough. But the idea that there are a bunch of things that some simple heuristics could actually clear out, and then we could, be able to kind of focus a little bit more on the expertise for those edge cases, or decide that the edge cases are acceptable. Obviously with it's healthcare, you can't, but when you get into, other things, like, hey, maybe it's all right if we, if we screw this up occasionally. I actually think there's something interesting there. I was looking at with some guidelines for like innovation projects, and the assumption in the guidelines was that at least 30% of your innovation projects were going to completely fail. And again, I'm kind of hand waving the numbers a little bit, but like the assumption that you're not pushing the boundaries enough unless you're having a certain amount of failure in the system, because we want the wins, and we're not going to get the wins unless we're pushing past this failure point. So those are all sort of characteristics, I think, to understand about, you know, the expectation is people aren't going to be perfect at this. What's an acceptable rate that we need to get them to, you know, versus, you know, again, places where you can kill people where you're trying for that 100%.
And Julie, for me, when we're looking at a transfer path, the whole thing that knowing that people will fail when they try and do things is all part of a transfer path. Because actually what you want to happen, not necessarily want to happen, but if someone fails, the key thing is you pick them back up, you get them observed from that failing, and you take them through the journey again with either additional support, new insights, or whatever they need to get to the point where they don't fail and then give up. Because it's if we apply it, it doesn't go quite as we thought. The temptation is, if we're not, haven't got a transfer process in place, whatever that looks like, to then go, well, actually, I'm going to go back to the old way because it was safer.
Yeah.
And because I knew how to do it. So I think, yeah, we've got to have failure. It's okay for failure, but then build people forward from that.
So that also, I just wonder, like, because the way I start to think about our work and how it's supposed to be is that we should do like ongoing analysis when it comes to that as well, right? Why are people failing? Is it because they don't know? Is it because they are under stress? What is the reason that they're failing? So I think for whatever we do, like ongoing, like those feedback loops. And I mean, I know it's really, you know, it requires a lot of systems change. But I think it's important, you know.
And often the person knows. So it can be as simple as asking the person. And again, this is the exciting thing about when you're capturing that information via a chatbot, you've actually got data easier accessible to you than actually if we were just capturing it through people. It's quite fascinating. But often the person knows, and the person can really pinpoint why it fell over that day.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, so acknowledging that we're going to have a certain amount of failure in the system, I think is actually a really good. We're basically hitting time, so I think that's a good note to kind of wrap on. So we're going to close it up. Are there any, Tracy? Were there any like particular questions we didn't hit or anything?
I think we hit them really well. There was a lot of interesting chats going on in there that I have captured, and we'll make sure we get up on our post. But I think the questions we addressed as we went along.
Okay,
so
and I see Tracy put books out. Emma and Mirjam, how about we start with Emma and then we'll do Mirjam. What would you like us to mention? This is the shameless plug portion where you're welcome to share anything with us that you're working on or that you're excited about or that you'd like people to know about.
I loved the conversation today, so thank you everyone to that. Thanks for just, really enjoyed it. I'm just super excited about the work that we're doing with Coach M at the moment. We're launching the new webpage, which is not out in the world yet, but that's the link to it. So if anyone wants a sneak peek of the new webpage, I put the link in the chat. But if anyone wants to just chat, I'm open. So please get people to reach out, LinkedIn, whatever. Wonderful. It's lovely to be part of this conversation and community.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there will be some follow-up conversations. I'm not done.
We're not done. We're not done.
The next episode.
All right. How about you, Mirjam?
I would like to continue the conversation for sure. I feel we only got started.
Yeah.
And I apologize because I didn't really focus too much on the chat because I was trying to focus on the conversation. So if anybody feels like, want to chat about something or want to ask something, just reach out to me. Well, I mean, I'm just, continuing with the blog. And if anyone wants to have a discount on the book, I'll put the code in the chat. It's AHR20 and you need to go through Kogan page, so you get like a 20% discount. So that's my shameless plug for today, which is still a bit uncomfortable, but there you go. And
we encourage
I really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah. All right. How about you, Tracy?
The only plug I've got coming up is the Canadian e-learning conference will be this June 10th and 11th and you can find information in canadianelearning.com. We will be online for 2021, and we're just working on getting the agenda ready for that.
Okay, fantastic. And I'd say Usable Learning is my website. And if you want to continue the conversation, I'm happy to do this in my Facebook group, which is the name of the Facebook group is Design for How People Learn, which is the book, which is my book title. So, but if anybody wants to come over, just mention that you know, if you're not already in the group, mention that you referenced it from here, and we will add you to the group. So. All right. Well, thanks everybody. This has been delightful. I'm so happy about being able to nerd out about this stuff. And thanks everyone. And thank you to Mirjam for staying up late and Emma for getting up early. We really appreciate it. I'm still amazed we pulled off this time zone thing. So.
Well, more credits to Emma than to me, because for me it's like 9 p.m. So it's still quite okay.
All right.
All good. Thanks, everyone. So nice
Wonderful.
to
All
chat.
right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.